what we're going to be talking about is something that is very topical and very troubling for most, including everyone on this call. And we have been able to secure, thanks to our colleague and friend Tara Jenkins at the newly found Conscious Capitalism chapter in Portland, Maine. She made a great introduction to Racial Equity Institute, and they will be doing quite a 2.5 hour detailed workshop that Tara has organised on the 12th of June. In support of Tara and her newly found chapter, what we thought we'd do today was just ask some of the speakers from REI, given what's been going on globally and nationally over the last week, just to help us get some clarity around these issues and understand what's going on. So before I introduce Bay, I just want to give you a quick snapshot as to what the conscious capitalism is about. I'll keep this very brief, but conscious capitalism is really just to understand the good that business can do and how it's been a tremendous system to break poverty for many people on the planet. But as we found out particularly in the last few months, it has serious sort of structural problems that we need to address. We have these 4 tenets that you can see behind me, really about, sure, we got to make profit, but there's got to be a higher purpose behind that. You need to build an organization that's got a healthy culture. It's a fun place to work, and it's a fun place to work because you're there as a leader to make sure that the people that are there are having a good career and good lives as a result of it. And that you see that your role in the business community is one of a multiple stakeholder concept. Now, these concepts are fine, but they're also great for business. Our founder, Raj Sisodia, has written extensively on this, particularly in this book, quoting that good to great companies are exceeding the financial performance of most S&Ps as well. What's conscious capitalism is a global movement, so there's 50 chapters globally. Connecticut is one of 40-something in the US. We are in the company of some very good brands. In the local chapter, we've been around since 2016. We've got a community of 1,600 CFOs and thought leaders that basically understand that business can do a much better job of creating some social change. And we are continuing this conversation on social media, and we are running a fabulous system of podcasts and very eager to hear from you and your social media stories, and there are my contact details there below. So let me now switch gears a little bit. Tara, would you mind taking this opportunity to tell us a little bit about your newly found chapter there and what this event's about on the 12th of June?
Happy to, Glenn. Thank you so much for the collaboration and the support. So we're so pleased and very sad in terms of the timing to be holding a session on June 12th called the Racial Equity Institute's Groundwater Session, which is storytelling and data that demonstrates and emphasizes structural racism in our society. And I think for all of us, we probably have some recognition of that, but maybe for many of us, it's easy for us to ignore it because it's not something that we come face to face with every single day. And so Bay and I have actually been planning that June 12th session for quite a while. It certainly did not have any idea when we were planning it that this timing would be so unfortunately perfect to hold the session. And anyone in this call is very welcome to attend. And I know that you can find it on your website for the Connecticut chapter, the link to register. And it's 8:30 to 11 o'clock on the morning of Friday, June 12th.
So, Bay, I'd like to introduce you and the Racial Equity Institute and to our conscious capitalism community here. Obviously, we're all here because we realise that, staying silent supports the status quo, and we're all here with the intention of helping change that. So we'd be grateful if you could lead us a little down this path today, and then I want to open it up to people on the call because it's all about you. So welcome, Bay.
Thanks so much. Realize I've got my name a little funky there. My name is not Bay Love with a W at the end. It's Bay Love with an E at the end. And I'm a member of the Racial Equity Institute. I'm calling in from Maine today, where I live in Portland with Tara. And yeah, really delighted about the partnership with Conscious Capitalism. We've been planning a lot of things, right, Tara? I mean, before COVID, we were planning on doing a full 2-day workshop where we have 40 people in a circle. And it was like, you know, the exact design of the workshop that we typically do is the exact way to maximize the vector for risk with COVID. So we've actually put all of our in-person training on hold. And so we decided to shift more towards this format. So the presentation we're doing on Friday is really not a substitute for the 2-day workshop. It sort of goes alongside it. Often groups will use it as a sort of lead into the 2-day workshop or a follow-up from the 2-day workshop. But it's basically an overview of racism as structural. I mean, the goal is to basically just say, why is it that we have such persistent racial inequity in the United States? And why is it that no matter what we seem to do, it's always there? And that's sort of the goal of the Racial Equity Institute actually, is to, you know, share what we've learned and share education that's hopefully useful for people who are really committed to ending racial inequity, about trying to understand what it is that's close to the root causes that are causing it. I just came today, as you can imagine. The Racial Equity Institute is a little bit slammed right now. So a bunch of my African-American colleagues who were thinking about potentially joining me today just wrapped up another session in New Orleans. So I apologize that they're not able to be here, but they will be with us on Friday.
Thanks, Bayard. I did get from your website a bit of a background document in what you describe as your groundwater approach. And I am just sharing on the screen now one of the slides in that, which is deeply disturbing to me and probably most people on the call, just to see what we mean by the inequities that we're dealing with. And it covers all sorts of spectrums of lifestyle, whether it's health, education, legal issues, child welfare and finance, and how the African-American chart is way higher than the baseline of their white counterparts in every case. And then, you know, similar to here too. So, I mean, seeing data this way really helps me understand the depth of despair and the income inequalities and inequalities in every way. So we'd love to hear from you, and I understand that many of your colleagues weren't able to join us at such short notice. So we do appreciate your willingness to just join this community at such short notice. But I'd love to hear, you know, what can we do apart from being vocal in our own communities and not accepting the status quo?
Well, I think that's right, Glenn. And I think that we're, in a way, we're all part of the problem. Certainly if we're white, we're part of the problem because we all live inside of a system that's designed, you know, that's our view really, is that we live in a system that really is designed to create these outcomes. And I think it sounds maybe perhaps trite, but I think one of the most important things for us to do is to really spend time rigorously analyzing what the challenge and the problem is, because we think that, well, certainly it's true that for the majority of our country's history, I mean, if you start with, you know, the founding of the first colony, Jamestown, right, in 1607, they say the first African people were brought here in 1619. So if you look at our collective history, starting back in the 1600s until today, the vast majority of that, you know, about 83%, between slavery and then Jim Crow, was legal racial apartheid, right? So we're looking at a very small 15 to 18% of our collective history that we've actually had, at least on paper, any kind of racial equity. Before that, we didn't even, you know, the dominant culture didn't even express the intention of having that, right? So we're talking about a very, very small, you know, part of our collective history. And, you know, for folks in business, it's like, if you understand the time value of money and the way that capital accumulates, you understand that when you have 83% of a society that's built where only white people and exclusively white people have access, and then you let people of color in for the last little bit, there's really nothing you can do to join a market 83% of the way in and get to equity unless there's a deliberate, right, and concerted effort to sort of level the playing field the way that it's been the way that it's been set up. And so I say that to say this: our experience in trying to work on racial equity around the United States is that mostly in the United States, we don't have that view of racial inequity. we think we mostly have a view that racism is about, you know, somebody not liking someone else, or, you know, you can even hear it now that it's about, you know, crooked police and corruption within the police force. And while those things may be true, there are bigots who dislike people and use their power in malicious ways because of those views. There are police that are corrupt and, you know, abusing power and all of that. But we don't think either of those or any of the other litany of things that we often point to when we talk about racial inequity really get to the root of the problem. And the root of the problem, as we're saying, is that we have a groundwater problem, as in this country, even though it doesn't look like it on the surface, actually is based on a caste system similar to India, where, you know, if you fall into a particular racial group, you are guaranteed a certain status. If you don't, you're not. And that has never changed. The only thing that's changed is the way that gets sort of mediated or managed. With slavery for the first chunk of history, about 60% of our history. And, you know, then we had another 23% in Jim Crow. And now we think it's managed through a whole bunch of other systems. And so our work is really about trying to understand those things. And Glenn, that's kind of the answer. My business background is I'm a consultant. You know, I was at Boston Consulting Group, you know, for the start of my career, and have always sort of gone back and forth between business strategy and sort of racial equity work. And at BCG, regardless of what the problem was, we would almost always structure our consulting engagements in a similar engagement. And the first stage was always a diagnostic, right? Second stage was about, you know, then painting a vision and a path forward. And then the third stage would be about implementation. And we think around racial equity, the first thing to do is for us to do a real rigorous and hard diagnostic. And a key part of that is what y'all stand for, Glenn, and what you do about, having the hard conversations. Because they are hard. You know, that's the first piece. And then we say diagnosis determines treatment, right? I mean, the whole point of doing the diagnostic is so then you can understand where the problem is and engage. And we'll talk more about this on Friday next week, but we think it's a pretty stark and frightening picture in a way of power imbalance in this country, such that you can maintain those inequities that Glenn had up on the screen year after year after year after year after year. And there's not actually a whole lot that the oppressed group can do about it, because there's just not sufficient power as manifest through economics, politics, control and influence on the culture and so forth. And so really what to do once we sort of get that in our guts is then to think about, all right, how does power work through those different means? And how do we begin to shift that so the power is working in a more equitable way?
So a question came in, Bay, about what kinds of things do you have businesses educate/diagnose? You want to talk about the specific tools or frames?
Yeah, so I'll give an example. So we were just on a call, and I think a couple of you were on there with New Orleans. We have colleagues in New Orleans that we work with who, you know, this woman came, she runs Propeller, which is an incubator, and they're funded by Kauffman Foundation, and they're, you know, trying to seed and grow, you know, small businesses in New Orleans. And they actually have a social impact focus, right? So businesses that are going to do good, very sort of aligned with what you all do. And she said that in terms of diagnosing the problem of race and racial inequity and how it plays out, we actually have to do it from top to bottom in our organization. So they started looking at things like, you know, the obvious things, right, are like hiring, right? Are we a diverse organization? Right? I mean, that's sort of one of the most obvious, most transactional, and doesn't actually get very deep, because you can be a very diverse organization and still be an organization that sort of contributes to the maintenance of racial inequity, we think. But once you have diversity and you look at hiring, then the question is retention, right? Do people stay, and do people move up in the organization, right? So those are like another cut deeper. But then she said, as we really started to look at it, we said, we evaluate and monitor all kinds of things and diagnose all kinds of things. And we started to go through all of those things with sort of racial justice lens, so that we could diagnose the places that we might be unknowingly or without wanting to perpetuating the racial inequity. So, you know, they revamped their entire performance evaluation system, actually, to say, how do we account for racial inequity here? Part of that is about saying, you know, that people who work in an organization that's committed to racial equity should grow in terms of their management and their ability to do public presentations and analyze data. And they should also grow in their understanding of racism, right? And their understanding of the roots of history and inequity. Because if you're going to become a business leader that's committed to social equity, they say you've got to understand the history. So we should evaluate people on that, like we evaluate people on their ability to, you know, explain, break down a P&L, right? The other piece was that oftentimes the way that performance metrics are set up are kind of holdovers from decades and decades and decades of practices that really don't lift up humanity. And I know you all are very familiar, with thinking about those kinds of things. So it's like, how do we look at the ways that are sort of our ipso facto, our de facto ways of operating, and how do those things build in, ways for racial inequity to maintain itself, right? One of the most obvious ones is, we were talking with some friends the other day who work with law schools. They work in the legal profession, and they're saying, gosh, we're working so hard to get people of color, into the firm, but we just can't get them to clear the hurdles around writing. We've done the mentorship programs, and we've done this and we've done that. And what we would say about that is, well, one, you got to prepare people, but even more important than that, what is it about, like, where did the legal profession develop its way of writing and its way of thinking and its particular logic, right, that we then evaluate people against? And if you really look at the history of the legal profession, it's really profound. I mean, it was the legal profession, if you will, and business is very much like this, has its roots in the earliest parts of our nation, right? And the legal profession was sort of a highly exclusive profession. It has been for a really long time. The American Bar Association, the first professional association for lawyers, was for whites only up until just about 30 or 40 years ago, right? When they explicitly took that down and tried to change the dynamic there. So what you end up happening is you have that all of the disciplines, including business and management consulting, for example, that we may work or live in, when it's built by white people for white people inside of a certain, cultural and historical context, the values and the ways of thinking and the ways of relating to the world just get built into the way that we do business, right? And you all are very familiar with that too, because I know as we look at capitalism, the way that it developed inside of an inhumane things, what we can see is the way that markets and trade and, profits and other things have been aligned with a system that is, inhumane and, unsustainable, such that some of the things that we've anchored on actually maintain the parts of our disciplines that we don't like, even as we're, just getting trained and working inside of those disciplines as they exist today. So when we talk about diagnosis, that's the kind of stuff that we're talking about, and we think it really is multi-pronged, and that's one way that I would answer that in terms of, thinking about it inside of one particular business.
Thank you. There's a question about your perspective on the current situation and the sequence of events that have unfolded across the past couple of weeks in terms of the call to action that it represents to grow racial equity. And one of our attendees likens it to maybe that we're in like the first step of a long, like a 12-step program, like just at the beginning of like recognizing the problem and how unmanageable things have gotten. What's your perspective?
I don't know how people are familiar with the 12 steps, but I would say more we're in the 12th step, which is about sharing your message to others, because I think the frightening reality in some ways, Eleanor, is like that, is that for a lot of people, certainly for people of color in this country, this is of course not new, right? I think my colleague Monica is a Black woman from Alabama, lives in North Carolina now, said it brilliantly on the last call. She said, we're at home from COVID. We're dealing with the death of George Floyd and the incredible, unrest or, uprisings, however you want to call it. She said, and we're also dealing with the reality that most people in this country are feeling surprised at the racial disparities in COVID deaths and impact. And that is not meant to say like we're all behind or anything like that, but it is meant to say that for my Black colleagues at the Racial Equity Institute, it is like they knew going in that it was going to be racially inequitable, right? And they knew when the stimulus package was coming down that it was going to be racially inequitable, unless, we had been sort of deliberately sort of anti-racist in the way that we were doing that. And so that would be the first thing, is that, and then we're wrestling, because I think so many people, myself included, there's just layers of this thing. Just when I think I'm sort of in the know, I'm then surprised again, that is this actually really how deep this stuff runs. So it's that. So I feel like as a society, we've got some people who are being newly aware, some people who are deepening our awareness, and some people who are just so aware that they're tired of people being surprised at the fact that this is sort of new for them. But I think that's absolutely right too, Eleanor, at the same time, is that we have an opportunity here to really to really see with more clarity, I think, that than we've seen before. And as I've been talking to people about it this week and trying to figure out how to sort of balance the short-term reaction with the long-term building, I think that a friend of mine, Catherine, said this morning that she's realizing that what there is right now for her, and I feel this way too, is a choice to really live life, like be in life fully, like with the world really as it is, or not. And I mean that really because I think this is a moment where we decide, are we going to engage in life and create a government and a society and a world that is sustainable and that we really believe in? Or are we going to sit back and sort of twiddle our thumbs and hope that things kind of work out for the better, right? And that's why I was so excited. I'm on vacation this week, but I was excited to connect with you guys because I really have, I know a little bit about conscious capitalism and what you all have done. I know that your lives really are already committed to saying, look, we've got to figure out a way to use what we have and what we know and take a stand for, transforming the most powerful systems that we live in. But I think that's the biggest thing, Eleanor, is for us to realize, holy smokes, this is deeper than we thought. And I think what we're hearing from people protesting and what I'm certainly feeling is that certainly in my opinion, but I think protesters would also agree, certainly not the Republican Party, but also the Democratic Party, its current platform, has not actually struck deep enough to the heart of this thing to provide a vision that's really going to get us where we need to go. And so I think that's the biggest thing, is for us to allow that sort of click and shift to happen, and then keep doing what we're doing on this call today, which is connecting and thinking and feeling and sort of staking our flag in the long-term work.
Oh, a question came in to Tara. So did you want to respond to Bay first before I pose that, Glenn?
Yeah, just if I could, and I might hand it over to Gavin, but we are obviously, as capitalists on the call, we are well aware of government and its failings in some of the institutions to manage social equity, which is kind of brings us back to, well, what can we manage? What can we control? And the only kind of encouraging thing I saw this week was when Amy Cooper, that woman who went nuts in died 9/11 in Central Park, she was fired by her employer because they have a zero tolerance policy. So it's encouraging to see that, because private organizations can set their own rules and they can hold their people accountable to that. And for me, that was encouraging. And yet we've seen so much change in the last few months that was completely involuntary, particularly in the way we're all working now. It's quite different to what it was. And we all said, no, we couldn't do that. My neighbor works for Goldman Sachs in New York, and for years they've said, no, you've got to come into the gilded office every day to be part of the crew. And now, of course, it's been working at home quite happily for the last 3 months, and everyone's more productive. So we've seen so many examples of outcomes that have been very positive from COVID. Is it reasonable to expect the same in terms of racial equity? And if so, how can we apply that?
I think it is. I don't know if she's a bit of a critic of capitalism, but Naomi Klein is someone whose thinking I like in moments like this. She wrote a book called The Shock Doctrine that was very popular in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And what she said was, she says that, and she's not the only one who says this, Milton Friedman she often quotes Milton Friedman as saying that what happens is that in moments of crisis, ideas or worldviews or systems that have been sort of waiting in the wings have an opportunity to come in and flood and take over the new system. Yeah. And so Milton Friedman would say, and Naomi Klein would also say, so our job has to be creating those systems of ideas and those systems of thinking and positioning them such that when the moment of disaster strikes, it's our ideas and our ways of thinking that sort of flood in. And I think that, Glenn, it's absolutely, there's a tremendous opportunity. I mean, I feel like just because of the, the rise in consciousness that step one, awareness that we were talking about, and the actual, I mean, when you think about $2 trillion getting invested into the economy, I mean, the amount of leverage that kind of investment has on the trajectory of our, country and economy is tremendous. But I think what is really up for grabs is what kind of change is going to happen here, if that makes sense. Naomi Klein often talks about, you look at other crises, whether it's the, post World War II, the Marshall Plan, post Great Depression, the New Deal, post Hurricane Katrina, the things that happened there. And, we took different tacks and learned different things. New Deal was great, lifted America out of the Great Depression, but was also built racial inequity as we know it today, right? Because we barred, agricultural workers and domestic workers from Social Security, because we made, home financing available, but, had redlining as part of that so that people of color couldn't take advantage of it. So I think absolutely there's an opportunity, Glenn. We're in the middle of it right now. So I worry that some of it, it's going by so fast, so we already can see the ways that with the, the PPP, for example, that probably contributed quite a bit to racial inequity. And so, as things continue to happen, I think we have to be vigilant and intentional to lean in where we can.
It's definitely, sort of just general obliviousness, on the part of a lot of people, not everybody, obviously. And that, to a great extent, has been swept away. At least people realize that there's a problem. They may not understand what the root of the problem is, but they get it that there's a problem, something's wrong. And then I guess the other thing I'm thinking about too is obviously there's two parts of this. Is what can you do, once you're awake, once you're aware that there is a problem, what's going on, if you can look then in your own company and see what systems do you have in place that, unintentionally you set up, decades ago, and all of a sudden you realize, wow, that's definitely unfairness built right into a system. So it wasn't intentional. On the other, the other thing I just want to mention too is like, though there is also that intentional side. There are people, especially in the, in government realms, where people are intentionally trying to skew it in all kinds of ways, and do it under the radar so that people don't realize what is being stacked up against people. And that's to a large extent creating, a lot of this boiling over right now, because people have been under a huge amount of unfair practices for a very long time, and it just keeps ratcheting up, including, just all the things that people are doing to try to keep people from voting that they don't want to have, that they don't want to vote, because democracy is a problem for these people who want to be in power. So they are stacking it up all day long and trying to oppress people, and it's completely not fair. And when you when you're sort of oblivious, you can, it's easy enough to be oblivious to that, think, oh, this is just, politics, this is just Republicans versus Democrats and stuff, until you realize that no, there's a much bigger thing going on here behind the scenes that is extremely deliberate.
Go ahead. One quick thought on that I think is a real gift of sort of the racial equity work is that studying racism, and I'm not really that old, but I have been doing this for a while. I mean, it's kind of unbelievable to me that it's been like 15 years that I've been training and consulting around racial equity specifically, is that when you study racism in this country, those kinds of things that you're talking about, Gavin, it becomes very clear that they're not conspiracy theories at all. Because that's been precisely how this racial inequity has maintained itself, decade after decade after decade after decade. I mean, it is just unbelievable. And I think that's part of the mismatch that we talk about the surprise. It's like when white people like myself can be so surprised to see like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this happened. And people of color are just like, my goodness, like, can you just, right, take a look and learn a little bit. And so I think that's right on. And we have to figure out a way to talk about and lead in a way that's strategic in the long term, and that where we communicate with a sort of calm that doesn't flip people off into calling us conspiracy theorists, but we have to start to show with data what's actually happening. Because my fear is that if we are if we are dismissed as conspiracy theorists for talking about this stuff, then we can't be effective at doing it, right? And you'll see on Friday, that's really what we try to do with this groundwater presentation, is sort of make a somewhat balanced and rigorous and evidence-based view for, you know, the argument that we live in structural racism or race-based catch-site. And even that language can be a little bit inflammatory, but that's kind of what we try to do. Sorry, Eleanor.
No, that's fine. Our members of our chapter here in Connecticut are kind of curious about our neighbors to the north here. So this question is for Tara about, you know, coming from Maine, which has this sort of stereotype as being such a white state, and yet has also been a case study for refugee groups, settlements from Somalia and elsewhere. You know, can you talk a little bit about sort of the stake Maine has in growing racial equity and how you came to kind of invite the Institute in?
Yeah, happy to. Yes, Maine, depending on what happens with the census, we're in the top 2 most whitest states in the nation. And so, yes, it is, I was wondering if people would be curious about why in Maine are we holding this session. And I think I do a lot of work with the immigrant community in Maine as well on a volunteer basis. And so it's really important. My thinking around this is shaped by that work. And my desire to see equitable society build as the generations of immigrants continue to live in Maine. And so I've spent personal time studying this topic over the last couple of years, and just felt very compelled as part of my role with conscious capitalism, because conscious leadership, a piece of it is structural intelligence. And I think the piece of structural intelligence that we're often missing in leadership, particularly white leadership, which is most of the leaders in Maine and across the nation, is this understanding of the structural racism and structural oppression that's been built into our systems. And to the earlier question, which I thought was great, around like, well, what do you look for? What's the diagnosis? To what Gavin and they were talking about, once you see it, it's everywhere. And so it's not hard to diagnose. It's then hard to prioritize what's the highest impact things to go after. And so for me, it was more getting that awareness within the conscious capitalism community in Maine as a starting point with that groundwater presentation. But as Bay mentioned, we have been talking about lots of other things that we could collaborate on, because I want Maine, I love living in Maine. We have a lot of work to do in Maine, but I want Maine to be known really as a state that's really thinking about running equitably as a state. And that's why we chose to do this session. And I think there's lots of ways that people can get involved, and lots of resources and lots of things coming up certainly now. But what I've most recognized is that it's not enough not to be racist individually. We all have to deliberately be anti-racist overall in our structures and in our communities. So there's a, I'm not a racist person. I like to think that, but I still always have work to do. But to be deliberately anti-racist in our communities and in our companies and in the systems in which we operate is a whole different thing. And I think we're all called to do that now.
It's interesting. There's an organization called Sustainable CT that has different towns and municipalities sign up to become more sustainable. And there's a whole equity component of that. And so I wonder if maybe, you know, Gavin or anyone has any thoughts on that relationship between, you know, you can't really be a sustainable whatever organization, community, business, or whatever if the equity piece isn't there.
Yeah, well, you definitely, you know, part of the thing, and Raj would totally agree with that. I think the driving force behind the whole conscious capitalism movement are the people that are working in your company. So, you know, if you care about those people, you know, that's what the healing organization ideas lead to. You're there because you care about these people and you want them to grow and flourish and do their best. And that means all of them, you know, every single one of them, and as to the best that you possibly can, and create as many opportunities as possible. So, you know, it is part of what we are as as human beings. It's you know, who we really should be. So yeah, I think, yeah, I'm not sure if I would naturally have thrown it into the bucket of sustainability, but it's certainly something that we all need to be doing.
So a couple comments have come in about, you know, balancing big picture national
Yeah,
challenges, and then local issues. Yeah, you probably saw that come
I
through.
saw that. I saw that one from Dan, I think. Yeah, I love that question, Dan. And I've been thinking a lot about it myself, a lot actually. And I think globally, act locally is a great one. I think that I'm trying to figure out how to articulate this, and we're sort of batting around different language about it. But I think there are things that we can do locally that empower the national work, and there are things that we can do locally that are disconnected from the national work, if that makes sense. And I'll just give an example from the political realm. I'm doing work with the Southern Poverty Law Center now, and they have they had one case, for example, that was about improving prison conditions for people in Alabama. Very, very important case. Very, very inhumane the way people are being treated inside of prisons in Alabama. But when people get better conditions in Alabama, they get better conditions in Alabama. That's it, right? On the other hand, SPLC just won the case in Florida, around reenfranchising formerly convicted felons. And so what happened was that they said, look, in Florida now, if you're convicted of a felony, you're going to be able to vote again, which I think Connecticut, actually, that used to be the deal, and then it got overturned as well. Now, in Florida, when they win that kind of case, what happens is we win people being able to be back in the political mainstream and participate fully as citizens, and we build political power. Does that make sense? Because now there's so many more voters that would vote an agenda sort of consistent with rehumanizing the prison population. So it's hard to make a case to not improve prison conditions for people in Alabama, but it's worthy to note that when we reenfranchise people who are back out post being convicted of a felony, it actually empowers the work for that state and nationally. And I think we need to look at our moves, what we do strategically with that sort of lens. So you can imagine a kind of work being done inside of your company that actually empowers your staff to go be politically engaged wherever they are. You can imagine, does that make sense? And so it's not like, one thing is we, clean up everything in our sandbox and in our house. And that's really important. I believe you got to sweep your own. It's another good 12 steps one, right? Like, you got to sweep your own doorstep before you go out into somebody else's, right? But it's also the case that there are things that we can do in-house that empower the larger movement, more broadly. Does that make sense? And so that's how I like to think about that, Dan. And I think it's a really important thing to slice. And I guess what it is to look for those win-wins where what we do globally also enhances the national, and use that as one of our sort of compasses as we try to figure out how to act in this moment.
So one of the things that troubles me the most around the pillars of capitalism is just the inequity of wealth, the wealth gap, if you like. And what's come up more recently is just an explosion of that. And one of the questions in the chat is interesting about our sort of conspiracy theories and how with the COVID thing, has that changed much in terms of how white people see this? I mean, Bay, you said you've been in this business for 15 years. What have we achieved, and what do we really hope, or what signs do we see at this point that the COVID will produce a different outcome or improve our trajectory?
Yeah, I'll share a quick story. I was in a session, another vacation session. I'm terrible. Teaching your employees about self-care is also a probably worthwhile endeavor. But I'm embarrassed to say I was in another session on Wednesday with the NIH, the National Institute of Health, and we had this exercise where we show people a diabetes death rate gap, right? I mean, it's very troubling. I mean, but the diabetes data looks just like the COVID data, right? I think in Maine, Tara, if you're Black in Maine, you're like 20 times as likely to have COVID or die from COVID relative to being white in Maine, which is just mind-boggling considering the demographics of the state, right? So it's not 20 to 1 with diabetes death rate, but it is 3 to 1, 5 to 1, 10 to 1, depending on where you live. So we give people these diabetes, death rates, and we ask them to do a rigorous diagnosis of the problem. What do they think is at the root of that, if they were to really get the root of it? And it was unbelievable to us that we gave people that data on Wednesday of this week. And what came back was food deserts, lack of access to healthcare, cultural eating habits, lack of green space, inability to exercise or lack of exercise, there was not anyone over about a 30-minute exercise who mentioned structural racism, right? Or the 400 years of racial apartheid and all of the stress and lack of access that comes to it. And so I would say, Glenn, and I think, Gavin, the way that you talked about it is resonant for me, that it feels to me that there is a large awareness of that there's a problem. But I think that we still have a lot to do to evolve our thinking about what that problem is and help ourselves and each other and other people sort of analyze that rigorously and appropriately. Because it's one thing to know there's a problem, but if I say, what's the problem? What's causing the diabetes death rate gap, right? And you come back and the answer is food deserts, then your solution is about solving food deserts and not about solving structural racism. So let me give you an example of what happens when you do that. We call that a lake solution. You go after the lake, but you don't get to the groundwater. In Greensboro, North Carolina, they said the problem's a food desert. So what we're going to do is we're going to build a community co-op, right? We believe in cooperatives. We believe in community, owned and run institutions. So we build the Renaissance Community Co-op in Greensboro, North Carolina. What happens, though, is that the income disparities and the wealth disparities are so severe that people in that community, A, didn't have enough money to sustain the co-op through their purchases, and B, the internalization of racial oppression of years of history and so on and so forth was so bad that even though people had the cooperative available, people still went to the other town to shop because people wanted to go shop where the white people shop. And so it was like, if we don't get the problem at its deepest level and we do a partial analysis of the problem, then we come and our solutions are partial solutions that can actually then be undermined, by the very same groundwater that created the problem in the first place. So, I think the opportunities are tremendous in terms of people's openness, the awareness that there is a problem, and someone was saying it's like a sales gig, right? It's one thing you get invited into the house, but you still have to make the sale. And I feel like we're at this moment now where it's like we're in, people are talking to us, but we've still got to come in and make sure that we sort of go all the way and really, and really make sure that we're getting deep enough so that we don't. There's another grade 12 test was half measures avail us nothing, right? And I think this is one of those where half measures may have us further in the hole from where we started.
A really important concern dropped into the chat about kind of whistleblower protections or on a more day-to-day basis, how to recognize the very real risk of blowback from raising issues in the workplace in particular.
That's just a real one. I
guess I'd say something.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Kind of along. So we had a food processing company, and one of the new regulation things that we had to conform with was some way for people, if they thought that there was a problem, that they could communicate that, and that somebody would listen to it, and that there wouldn't be any blowback on them. So and actually what the auditors would do, this is an outside group that would come in and audit us. What they would do is talk to people and try to find out how safe they felt about speaking up. So it's a psychological safety issue, essentially. So it's kind of along the lines of like Toyota, in their lean process and everything. Do you feel like you can pull the cord and stop the entire assembly line, if there's a problem with this part? So if there's a food safety issue, do you feel like you can, stop this thing from running and do something about it? And in the same sort of vein, do you feel safe that you can bring this concern up and that you'll be heard and that there isn't going to be any blowback on you? And that's, really that's leadership's job. And so, if a company's got a great leader, that leader will set up that psychological safety, and so that people feel like they can actually come and talk about those things. So, if the leader admits that they don't know everything, if the leader admits that they make mistakes sometimes, and when they make a mistake, they freely point it out, then that's the sort of thing that allows other people to realize, oh, okay, so if I make a mistake on something, yeah, it's okay for me to bring it up too. And, in the same, so basically leadership has to, not only admit that they don't know everything and that they can make mistakes, and even, on racial issues and stuff, and that that their awareness is growing. And if they state that and make it clear to everybody that that's where they're coming from, they're making it safe for other people to explore that as well. I think that's the way that I would go about creating it in a company. So that's my 2 cents.
Can I make a comment related to this? I don't know if it's okay.
Sure.
So I'm thinking specifically of a very old friend of mine who's a Black Latinx woman who worked in a large New York City Wall Street firm for many, many years and actually helped to create their communications department. And they promoted everybody else around her and actually could not understand why she was thinking that she was discriminated against. And she resisted for a long time, and then finally she actually took a court case. And in the end, she didn't win in court because the judge's attitude, just like the employer's attitude, was basically, you're making 6 figures. You're living the kind of lifestyle that, we, and I'm saying we people of color, are not supposed to expect to live. So what are you complaining for?
Right.
And how do you address that?
Yeah.
That's like the deepest forms of.
Yeah, it definitely helps.
Absolutely.
It definitely helps if you've got a conscious leader. I think, what I was sort of saying before is that, there is, obviously there was a lot of obliviousness, people just not aware, not bad or anything, just not aware. There's a lot of deliberateness about some of this stuff. But the only way to, so if companies have been oblivious, the only way they're gonna wake up is if leadership, steps up and does a proper job of it. So, I'll say one of the really frustrating things for me is how unlikely it is for the right person to get the top job. It almost always goes to somebody who's a jerk, and
well,
I don't know what it is about it, but if you're making multiple millions of dollars, by definition you're a jerk. It's like it's just ridiculous. There's no way that you should be getting that much money because you're totally not worth it. Nobody's worth that much. And if you're not,
and I was just going to add briefly, because Gavin, you were describing leadership utopia, and I know we all strive for that, but it is really rare. And so one of the things that I think we can offer individuals that are in a retaliatory system, which there are many of them, and as you said, Shelley, even if you were to exercise your legal rights to try to reinforce retaliation not happening, you go into a court system that is also part of the same structure and systems for promoting and perpetuating white advantage. So it's a problem no matter what. But what I've seen in organizations that I've worked in, because I have 25 years of experience working in human resources, is when, and in particular in these times, what we see is employees, social media, grassroots efforts coming from the bottom of organizations are far more powerful than they ever used to be. And if we don't have a unionization mentality in this country, maybe that will return again. But what we do see is power coming from employees speaking out and banding together to say to leadership that Gavin's describing as corrupt, that's not going to be acceptable, and they have a different platform. So there's obviously huge risks associated with that as well. And I think that has to be taken really seriously. But when I do a peer counseling online volunteering thing to coach people when they're handling situations like retaliation in their workplaces, and more and more common it is them figuring out how to find their voice in the organization through different channels or through collaborating with others. And so I think that's an option that we should be considering helping people understand how to do.
I think one of the most encouraging things that I've seen, pre-COVID, is the more companies are adopting a sort of open recruiting methods where they have, no filters whatsoever, and their company results have proven to be quite successful as well. So that's, Tara, to your previous life in HR, it would ruffle their feathers, I'm sure, but it is proving to be a successful way of building a very healthy culture and creating that sort of bottom-up thing that you're talking about. And Bayard, I just want to thank you for joining us today. We're close to wrapping up, and I realize just listening to you and your journey over the last 15 years how little I know about the structure and how I am very passionate about this as an idea, but how I'm somewhat unschooled in terms of what can I physically do about it. So I'm looking forward to joining you on June 12th so I can, overcome that ignorance because what I have learned, there's an urgency about it now that on top of all the other things that we have to deal with, and it should become part of the structural new world that evolves. I just wanted to sort of close it with sharing my enthusiasm around that big idea, and I'm grateful for your availability today, Bay, at such short notice. And Bay, did you want to just wrap it up?
Yeah, no, I just want to say thank you all. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Tara, particularly for your work, and Glenn and Gavin and Eleanor and other people. Sorry for the traffic noise. But yeah, it's lovely to meet you, and I trust and look forward to our paths crossing again soon.
All right, 4 o'clock on time. We got to get you out of here on time. Love seeing you guys. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.